Tonight we explore the timeless questions that have shaped how humans live together in organized society. How did ancient thinkers first grapple with justice, power, and the common good? When did philosophers begin questioning whether authority comes from gods, nature, or human agreement? And how did their answers create the political systems we inhabit today? 3,000 years ago, the world organized itself through entirely different principles. Most humans lived under rulers who claimed divine right, answering to heaven or the gods rather than the governed. Communities held land in common. Decisions emerged from tradition, and the idea that ordinary people could choose their own leaders seemed absurd. Then something changed. Across the ancient world, from Athens to China, revolutionary thinkers began asking dangerous questions. What if wisdom, not birth, should determine who rules? What if society is not natural but constructed? What if political power requires the consent of those it governs? These questions would transform not just how governments function, but the very meaning of citizenship, freedom, and human dignity. This is the story of how political philosophy evolved from the debates of Athenian assemblies to become the foundation of modern democracy. We'll trace how these ideas traveled through time and across continents, from Plato's ideal republic to Confucius's moral governance, from Hobbes's state of nature to Rousseau's general will, from the mandate of heaven to the social contract, from natural rights to global justice. Along the way, we'll meet the visionary thinkers who imagined new ways of living together. Solon, witnessing the fragility of order in ancient Athens, Aristotle declaring humans to be political animals by nature, Locke arguing that government exists solely to protect our rights, Mill defending individual liberty against the tyranny of the majority, and Rawls designing justice behind a veil of ignorance. We'll also encounter those who resisted, the rebels who challenged unjust authority, the philosophers who warned against unchecked power, the movements that demanded accountability from their rulers. We'll discover how Confucian virtue ethics shaped 2 millennia of Chinese governance, how the persecution of women during the witch hunts served capitalism's need to control reproduction, how anarchist thinkers challenged the very necessity of the state, and how conservative philosophers asked what wisdom we lose when we change too quickly. We'll explore the paradoxes that still define political life, how we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how rights can conflict with other rights, how leadership demands both effectiveness and integrity, and how truth struggles against misinformation in the digital age. This journey will reveal that the political order we take for granted, democracy, human rights, constitutional limits on power, the rule of law, is neither inevitable nor permanent. These are human achievements, built through centuries of struggle, refined through countless experiments, and maintained only through our ongoing participation and care. As we begin this exploration, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Especially if you enjoy these philosophical journeys, your engagement helps others discover these explorations of the ideas that shape our world. And if there are particular political philosophers or concepts you'd like us to explore in future videos, please share your thoughts below. Now, dim the lights, perhaps light a candle, and let's ease into our philosophical journey together. In ancient Athens, political thinkers watched the rise and fall of city-states and glimpsed the first questions of how societies hold together. The scene opens with rival factions clashing over law and leadership, illuminating the fragility of early political order. Picture, if you will, the ancient Greek city-state of Athens in the 6th century BCE. The great statesman Solon stood witness to what the Greeks called stasis, a particular form of civic discord that tore communities apart from within. These weren't mere disagreements or peaceful debates, but violent confrontations between factions fighting over the very constitution of their society. The Athenians understood something profound, that order itself was fragile, requiring constant maintenance, conscious design, and shared commitment to endure. They saw how competing noble families, the oikoi with their vast networks of clients and followers, would clash not just for power, but for the right to define what law itself meant. This raises the core insight that humans must consciously design systems that guide collective life. We cannot assume that society will organize itself naturally or that traditions alone will hold us together through times of crisis. These ancient insights echo powerfully in our own time. Today, we see these struggles mirrored in polarized societies, wrestling with authority and legitimacy. Just as the Athenians faced factions mobilizing citizens as pawns in elite power struggles, our modern democracies witness similar patterns. Competing groups claiming to represent the true will of the people while often pursuing their own interests beneath the surface rhetoric. The Greek concept of the Aristotelian ideal, the drive to always be first and superior to others, lives on in our contemporary political arena, where prestige and recognition often matter as much as policy substance. Yet the ancient Greeks also gave us hope through figures like Cleisthenes, who in 508 BCE established isonomic institutions, equal rights for all citizens, showing that political systems could be consciously designed to promote justice and stability. This is the enduring paradox of political philosophy. How do we create order that serves the common good, while managing the natural human tendency toward factional competition? As this first exploration comes to rest, consider this reflection. Viewers can reflect on how their communities rely on shared rules that were intentionally created, not naturally given. The traffic laws that guide your daily commute, the institutional structures that provide your water and electricity, the legal frameworks that protect your rights, none of these emerged spontaneously. They were all designed by humans who faced the same fundamental question. The Athenians confronted: how do we create systems that allow us to live together peacefully while preserving what we value most? In our next segment, we'll discover how thinkers like Thomas Hobbes would later grapple with this question in an age far removed from ancient Athens, yet facing remarkably similar challenges. For now, let the ancient wisdom settle. Political order is neither inevitable nor permanent, but rather a precious achievement requiring our ongoing attention and care. In classical Athens, Plato watched political chaos and envisioned a republic guided by wisdom rather than passion. Picture, if you will, the bustling streets of Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era. A city that had known the golden age of Pericles, the devastating losses of the Peloponnesian War, and the bitter taste of tyranny under the rule of the 30. It was here, amid the echoes of democratic assemblies and philosophical debates in shaded colonnades, that a young aristocrat named Plato witnessed something that would shape the course of Western thought forever. He watched his beloved teacher, Socrates, the wisest man he had ever known, condemned to death by the very democratic system Athens so cherished. And in that moment of profound loss, Plato began to ask questions that still haunt us today. How should human beings be governed? Who is truly fit to lead? And can a society ever be arranged in such a way that justice, real justice, might flourish? From this crucible of personal grief and political disillusionment, Plato crafted what many consider the foundational text of political philosophy, the Republic. Written around 375 BC, this dialogue imagines a city he called Callipolis, the beautiful city, where society would be organized into 3 harmonious classes. At the base were the producers, the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who created the material goods of life. Above them stood the auxiliaries, soldiers and guardians who protected the community. But at the apex, Plato placed something extraordinary: philosopher kings. These were not rulers who merely accumulated power or charmed the masses with silver tongues. They were individuals who had undergone rigorous intellectual and moral training, who had studied mathematics and dialectic, who had glimpsed what Plato called the form of the good itself. Imagine, Plato asks us, a ruler who seeks power not for personal gain, but because they understand with perfect clarity what is truly best for all. Such rulers, he believed, would shepherd their society like skilled physicians tending to the health of the whole body politic. Plato offered a striking analogy to illustrate his concerns about democratic leadership. Picture a great ship at sea, he suggested through the voice of Socrates. The owner of the ship is strong but somewhat deaf, his vision impaired, his knowledge of navigation limited. All the sailors aboard argue about who should steer, each believing himself capable, yet none has actually studied the craft of navigation. They do not even believe such expertise exists. Whoever proves most persuasive with the shipowner takes the helm, regardless of actual skill. This, Plato warned, is what happens when societies choose leaders based on popularity rather than wisdom. The ship may sail for a time, but without true navigation, disaster awaits. This ancient metaphor finds echoes in our modern world, does it not? We watch as electoral campaigns become exercises in persuasion rather than demonstrations of competence. We see leaders rise through charisma, while questions of genuine wisdom, of understanding complex systems, of moral clarity, often fade into the background. Plato's concern was not with democracy as an ideal of equality, but with a fundamental question: does the crowd always know what it needs? At the heart of Plato's vision lies a profound insight about the relationship between human nature and governance. He believed that just as the human soul contains distinct parts, reason, spirit, and appetite, so too must a healthy society reflect this natural order. When reason rules over the spirited and appetitive elements within us, we achieve personal harmony. When philosophers who embody reason guide the auxiliaries and producers, society achieves collective harmony. Justice, for Plato, was precisely this, each part performing its proper function, contributing to the well-being of the whole. Notice how this ancient wisdom might illuminate our contemporary challenges. In an age of instant information and emotional reaction, we might ask whether our collective decisions are guided by careful reasoning or by the appetite for immediate satisfaction. When we choose leaders, do we seek those who help us think clearly about difficult trade-offs, or those who simply tell us what we wish to hear? Plato invites us to imagine communities where thoughtful deliberation is honored, where expertise is valued not as elitism, but as service, where the goal of governance is not merely power, but the genuine flourishing of all citizens. Let this vision rest gently in your mind as you consider what harmony might look like in your own community, in your own life. For Plato's dream, imperfect as any human vision must be, points towards something timeless, the hope that wisdom and justice might yet guide human affairs, like stars steering a ship safely through the night. Plato's student Aristotle inherited his teacher's questions about the ideal society, but offered a fundamentally different answer rooted in human nature itself. What if humans are political animals by nature? Aristotle's answer challenges everything we believe about individuality and community. Tonight, we journey back to ancient Greece, to a thinker who saw something profound about human nature that we still grapple with today. In the 4th century BCE, in the shadow of the Acropolis, Aristotle gazed upon the bustling city-state of Athens and proposed something radical: that our very essence as human beings is defined by our capacity to live together in organized communities. Not just any communities, but communities dedicated to the pursuit of what he called eudaimonia, human flourishing. As we settle into this quiet reflection, consider this fundamental question. Are you truly an individual, or are you part of something larger that makes you who you are? Aristotle's insight emerged from careful observation of the natural world around him. He noticed that humans, unlike other creatures, possess the unique capacity for reasoned speech, what he called logos. But more than that, he recognized that this rational capacity finds its fullest expression not in solitary contemplation, but in organized political life. The polis, or city-state, was not merely a practical arrangement for mutual defense or economic exchange. It was the natural environment where human beings could achieve their highest potential. Think of it this way. Just as a fish finds its fulfillment in water, the human being finds fulfillment in the political community. This was not a constraint upon individual freedom, but rather its precondition. The isolated individual, Aristotle observed, is either a beast or a god, outside the natural order of human existence. But Aristotle's vision of political community was remarkably sophisticated. The polis he described was not a crude collective that subsumed individual identity. Rather, it was an organic unity where citizens could participate meaningfully in shared governance. Each person brought their unique virtues and perspectives to the common life, while the community provided the structure within which those virtues could flourish. This was the essence of what Aristotle called the good life, not happiness as momentary pleasure, but eudaimonia as the active exercise of human excellence in community with others. The ancient debates about what constitutes a good and flourishing society centered on questions that remain deeply relevant. How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? What is the proper role of government in human life? How do we organize ourselves so that all members of the community can thrive? Today, these ancient dilemmas echo through our contemporary questions about belonging and civic identity. In an age of social media echo chambers and political polarization, Aristotle's insight that we are fundamentally political animals speaks to our deepest longings for genuine community. The question of how to maintain our individual identity while contributing to something larger than ourselves remains as pressing as ever. Think about your own life. What communities do you belong to? How do they shape who you are? The challenge, as Aristotle understood it, is not to choose between individual fulfillment and communal belonging, but to find ways of living that honor both. You might begin this week by consciously nurturing relationships that strengthen your shared environments, whether that's your neighborhood, your workplace, your religious community, or your circle of friends. For in tending to these bonds, you participate in the most ancient of human endeavors, the creation of conditions where both you and your fellow citizens might flourish together. Let that thought settle in your mind as we prepare for what comes next in our philosophical journey. In ancient China, Confucius wandered from state to state, seeking rulers who valued virtue above power. An elderly scholar traverses the dusty roads of the spring and autumn period around 500 BCE, when the great Zhou dynasty was fragmenting into competing kingdoms. Gongqiu, the man we know as Confucius, carried with him no army, no treasury, no promises of territorial expansion. He carried only ideas about how human beings might organize themselves not through force or fear, but through the cultivation of moral character. For 14 years, he traveled from court to court, offering his services to any ruler who would listen, and finding, again and again, that the powerful preferred conquest to cultivation, that they sought advantage rather than virtue. And yet, he persisted. Let us rest here, in the contemplation of a man whose apparent failure would shape the lives of billions. The scenario highlights how moral governance became a blueprint for social harmony across millennia. Confucius did not invent new philosophies so much as he claimed to transmit the wisdom of ancient sages, the values he believed had been abandoned in his turbulent time. At the heart of his teaching was a revolutionary idea. That authority must be grounded in ethical character. He spoke of the junzi, a term that originally meant simply son of a ruler, belonging to nobility by birth alone. But Confucius transformed this concept entirely. In his vision, the junzi became the gentleman, the exemplary person, one whose nobility arose not from bloodline but from behavior, from cultivating humaneness, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. Imagine what this meant in a world where power flowed through inheritance and military might. Confucius was suggesting that a peasant who cultivated virtue was more noble than a prince who did not. That true authority was earned through moral excellence, not seized through birth or battle. This reveals the profound insight that leadership without integrity is merely domination wearing a crown. In the Analects, the collection of Confucius's teachings compiled by his students after his death, we find a vision of governance as fundamentally educational. The ruler, Confucius taught, must be like the North Star, remaining fixed in position while all other stars revolve around it in orderly movement, not because the North Star commands obedience, but because it provides orientation, a still point by which others can navigate. When asked how to govern, Confucius replied simply, "Lead by moral example. If the leader desires good, the people will be good." The moral character of the grass, he said, bends in whatever direction the wind blows. This was not mere idealism. It was a sophisticated understanding that sustainable social order cannot be maintained by punishment and surveillance alone. That when leaders embody the virtues they wish to see, they create a kind of moral gravity, drawing others naturally toward ethical behavior. Consider how this insight illuminates our modern anxieties about political leadership, about the gap between public rhetoric and private conduct, about our deep intuition that those who govern us should embody something higher than mere competence or ambition. Modern discussions about leadership integrity, about accountability and character in public life, about whether we can separate a leader's private morality from their public effectiveness. All these debates echo through 25 centuries from the dusty roads Confucius walked. When we feel disturbed by hypocrisy in our institutions, when we sense that something essential is missing from leadership that achieves results without inspiring trust, we are feeling the absence of what Confucius called the moral power or virtue. Think of the communities you inhabit, the organizations you work within, the families you belong to. Confucian philosophy invites us to recognize that we are all, in our own spheres, centers of moral influence. The colleague who maintains integrity under pressure, the parent who apologizes to their child when wrong, the friend who speaks difficult truths with kindness, each becomes a kind of North Star for others. Authority, in this understanding, is not something conferred by title or position. It radiates naturally from character. As we let these ancient teachings settle into stillness, consider this gentle paradox. Confucius, who spent 14 years being rejected by the rulers of his time, who died believing his mission had largely failed, became one of the most influential thinkers in human history. His ideas were eventually adopted as official state philosophy under Emperor Wu of Han, and for over 2,000 years shaped the governance of China and much of East Asia. The wandering scholar who sought virtuous rulers became, through his failure, a teacher of virtue to countless generations. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of Confucian order, that true moral influence does not depend on immediate success, that living according to principle plants seeds we may never see flower. Rest now with this thought, breathing slowly, allowing the image of that ancient wanderer to become a companion in your own journey toward cultivating virtue, one small action, one moment of integrity, one genuine connection at a time. Confucius's emphasis on moral character found its parallel in another Chinese concept that made rulers accountable not just to virtue, but to heaven itself. When Chinese dynasties faced natural disasters, rulers feared losing the mandate of heaven. Imagine a ruler sitting in his palace as floodwaters rise across his kingdom. The crops fail, the people begin to murmur, and in that moment, a terrifying question emerges. Has heaven withdrawn its blessing from my rule? The mandate of heaven, first articulated by the Zhou dynasty over 3,000 years ago, was more than a political theory. It was a cosmic accountability system. Unlike the European divine right of kings, which suggested that God had appointed specific rulers, the mandate of heaven was conditional. Heaven, conceived as the universal principle that governs all existence, would bless a ruler only as long as that ruler governed with virtue, wisdom, and justice. The Zhou kings used this doctrine to legitimize their overthrow of the Shang dynasty, claiming that the Shang rulers had become corrupt and tyrannical, thus forfeiting heaven's mandate. What makes this concept extraordinary is how it created a mechanism for political accountability in an age without modern institutions. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, famines were interpreted as heaven's warning that the ruler had failed in his moral duties. The classical Chinese text Mencius explicitly stated that rebellion against an unjust ruler was not only permissible but morally required when the ruler had lost heaven's mandate. This created what we might call the first systematic theory of legitimate revolution, rooted in the idea that ultimate sovereignty belongs not to any earthly ruler, but to the cosmic order itself. While we may no longer believe disasters signal divine displeasure with our leaders, the underlying insight remains remarkably relevant. Contemporary leaders still face what we might call public mandates that can be withdrawn through elections, protests, and democratic accountability mechanisms. The ancient Chinese insight was that political authority must always remain accountable to something higher than mere power itself, whether that be moral principles, cosmic justice, or in our modern context, the collective will and ethical standards of the governed. Perhaps the most peaceful and ethical way we can hold institutions accountable today is through sustained civic engagement, informed participation in democratic processes, and the cultivation of public virtue that reminds all leaders that their authority ultimately derives from the consent and trust of those they serve. This ancient Chinese wisdom about accountability and consent anticipated questions that would preoccupy European philosophers 2 millennia later. What if society is nothing more than a fragile agreement among individuals? Social contract theorists confront this unsettling possibility. In 17th century England, 3 thinkers would transform how we understand political legitimacy, not as divine inheritance or brute force, but as a compact among equals. Their answers differed dramatically. For Thomas Hobbes, witnessing Civil War's chaos, the contract meant exchanging freedom for security under absolute power. John Locke, shaped by the Glorious Revolution, saw it as conditional protection of natural rights that could be withdrawn when governments failed their purpose. Jean-Jacques Rousseau posed the deepest paradox, that true freedom emerges only through submitting to collective will. These profound explorations continue to shape our contemporary world in ways both obvious and subtle. Modern civic duties, from jury service to paying taxes, rest upon these ancient agreements about mutual obligation. When citizens debate the balance between security and privacy, they are grappling with the same trade-offs these philosophers wrestled with centuries ago. Social media platforms, with their complex terms of service, represent a new form of digital social contract. Climate change challenges us with questions about intergenerational justice that extend the social contract beyond our immediate communities to future generations. Each time we vote, protest peacefully, or engage in civil discourse, we participate in the grand experiment these philosophers began, the ongoing project of creating legitimate authority that serves human flourishing while respecting individual dignity. Let us examine each of these revolutionary thinkers in turn, beginning with the darkest vision of human nature. In war-torn 17th century England, Thomas Hobbes imagined a world where life without government would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Picture this. You wake one morning to find that all laws have vanished, all authorities have disappeared, all contracts have dissolved. What would happen in that first day? What would happen by week's end? This wasn't mere speculation for Hobbes. He lived through the English Civil War, witnessing society fracture along lines of profound ideological division. In his masterpiece, Leviathan, published in 1651, he painted a terrifying picture of what he called the state of nature, a condition where life becomes nothing more than a perpetual struggle for survival, where every person becomes both hunter and hunted. But let us understand what Hobbes truly means by this war of all against all. It's not merely physical violence, though that would certainly be present. It's the absence of any shared framework for resolving disputes, any common authority to establish what's just or unjust, any reliable expectation that others will keep their word. In such a world, even the most basic human interaction becomes fraught with calculation and fear. Why share your food with a neighbor when they might simply take it by force? Why honor a promise when there's no consequence for breaking it? Why cooperate when competition might serve you better? This creates what Hobbes saw as the fundamental paradox of human nature. We are rational beings capable of cooperation, yet we're driven by competing desires that can undermine the very cooperation we need to survive. The genius of Hobbes's insight lies not in pessimism about human nature, but in his recognition that civilization itself is fragile, a delicate web of mutual agreements that can unravel when we least expect it. When social institutions weaken, when trust erodes, when uncertainty replaces predictability, we begin to see glimpses of the state of nature Hobbes described. Consider moments in our own time when the social fabric frays, political polarization, where compromise becomes betrayal, economic systems that reward short-term gains over long-term stability, algorithmic amplification of division rather than understanding. Each represents a thread beginning to unravel, reminding us that the order we take for granted is neither inevitable nor permanent. Yet here's where Hobbes's thought becomes profoundly relevant to our lives today. Understanding the value of cooperation and predictable rules doesn't require us to embrace authoritarianism. Instead, it reveals why our collective agreements, our social contracts, deserve our active participation and protection. Every time we choose honest communication over manipulation, every time we respect agreed-upon procedures rather than seeking shortcuts, every time we invest in institutions that serve the common good rather than narrow self-interest, we are choosing civilization over chaos. The state of nature isn't a historical curiosity from 17th century England. It's a reminder that the peaceful, cooperative world we inhabit exists only through our shared willingness to build and maintain the bridges of trust that connect us all. What if governments exist solely to protect life, liberty, and property? John Locke's revolutionary answer redefined not just political legitimacy, but our very understanding of authority itself. Born during the tumultuous aftermath of England's Civil War, Locke witnessed firsthand what happens when power becomes untethered from principle. Following his exile after the Rye House plot, he completed his seminal work, the two treatises of government, published anonymously in 1689 following the Glorious Revolution. Where Hobbes had emphasized security above all, Locke presented a vision that would fundamentally reshape how societies justify political authority. Unlike the divine right of kings that had dominated European thought, Locke argued that governments derive their legitimacy not from hereditary claims or religious mandate, but from their ability to secure the natural rights that exist prior to any political arrangement. These rights, life, liberty, and property, were not gifts from monarchs or governments, but inherent aspects of human existence itself. And this distinction, seemingly simple yet profoundly radical, would echo through the corridors of democratic thought for centuries to come. But Locke's genius lay not merely in identifying these natural rights, but in drawing an extraordinary conclusion about the nature of political authority itself. If rights exist independently of government, then government becomes fundamentally conditional, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Imagine hiring a security guard to protect your home. The guard's authority comes not from their personal power, but from their ability to fulfill their duty. If they instead began stealing from you or harming your family, their authority would dissolve immediately. This is precisely how Locke viewed the relationship between citizens and their government. The two treatises presented authority as a sacred trust, conditional upon the protection of natural rights. When a government fails in this fundamental duty, when it becomes destructive rather than protective, Locke believed the social contract dissolves, and the people regain their original liberty to establish new governance. This wasn't mere theoretical speculation. It was a philosophical foundation for justified revolution that would inspire democratic movements for generations. Today, these Lockean principles form the invisible architecture of constitutional democracies worldwide. The American Declaration of Independence's famous assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights directly echoes Locke's natural rights philosophy. Modern constitutions, from Germany's Basic Law to India's Constitution, embed this conditional view of authority, the idea that power exists only to serve the people, not vice versa. How do we instinctively react to government overreach today? When authorities abuse their power, we invoke concepts of civil rights and constitutional limits that trace their philosophical lineage to Locke's insights. The very mechanisms we use to hold governments accountable, impeachment proceedings, judicial reviews, peaceful protests, all rest on the Lockean premise that political authority must earn its legitimacy through service to protected rights. Yet perhaps the most contemplative aspect of Locke's natural rights philosophy lies in its implications for our own civic lives. If rights exist prior to government, then citizenship becomes not merely about obeying laws, but about actively participating in the delicate balance between protection and freedom. When you exercise your right to vote, you're participating in the ongoing negotiation between liberty and security that Locke recognized as the heart of political legitimacy. When you engage in peaceful protest against injustice, you're exercising the very natural liberty that governments exist to protect. And when you pay taxes or serve on a jury, you're fulfilling the reciprocal responsibilities that make natural rights sustainable in collective life. Locke understood that natural rights without civic responsibility would dissolve into chaos, just as government without rights protection would devolve into tyranny. This is the beautiful paradox of liberal democracy. We are simultaneously subjects entitled to protection and citizens responsible for the common good. In our contemporary moments of political division, returning to Locke's foundational insight that government exists to serve rights, not the other way around, offers a framework for navigating disagreement while preserving the shared commitment to human dignity that underlies all legitimate authority. When Rousseau imagined citizens gathering in collective purpose, he introduced the paradox of freedom through unity. Imagine the citizens of Geneva in 1762, not as separate individuals pursuing their private interests, but as members of a greater whole, assembling to determine what is truly best for all. Where Hobbes saw order requiring submission and Locke saw liberty requiring protection, Rousseau's revolutionary insight was that true freedom emerges not from unchecked individual desire, but from participation in something larger than oneself. This was his profound paradox, that we become most free when we willingly submit ourselves to the general will of the community. But what exactly did he mean by this mysterious general will, and how does it differ from the mere aggregation of individual preferences? The general will, as Rousseau conceived it in The Social Contract, 1762, is not simply what most people happen to want at any given moment. Instead, it represents what rational individuals would choose if they could see beyond their immediate, selfish interests and consider the genuine good of the entire community. Imagine citizens setting aside their personal ambitions to deliberate as if they were legislators for a society that included their future selves, their children's generation, and even those who currently oppose their views. This general will, Rousseau argued, is sovereign. It alone has the legitimate right to create laws, because when we obey laws that express this collective wisdom, we are obeying only ourselves. Yet this creates a delicate tension. How do we balance individual conscience with collective wisdom? How do we protect minorities against the tyranny of the majority while still maintaining the authority of the general will? This tension manifests vividly in our contemporary debates about public policy and social obligation. Consider mandatory vaccination policies during public health crises, individual autonomy conflicts directly with community protection. Rousseau would argue that rational citizens, considering the genuine good of all, would choose vaccination, making this a true expression of the general will. But what about more complex issues, like climate change legislation, where immediate economic costs conflict with long-term collective survival? Rousseau's insight suggests that our individual preferences are often shaped by narrow self-interest, while the general will emerges when we transcend these limitations through reasoned deliberation. Yet the practical challenge remains. How do we distinguish between authentic general will and the manipulation of popular opinion? How do we prevent demagogues from claiming to speak for the general will while serving their own ambitions? Perhaps the most profound question Rousseau leaves us with is personal. When do you find yourself aligning with communal interests? And when do you feel your individual conscience pulling you in a different direction? Think about moments in your own life, perhaps when you've chosen to wear a mask during illness, despite personal discomfort, or when you've supported policies that might inconvenience you personally, but serve the broader community. These small acts of voluntary submission to collective welfare hint at Rousseau's deeper wisdom, that our highest freedom emerges not from doing whatever we desire, but from participating consciously in the ongoing project of creating a just society. The paradox of freedom through unity challenges us to ask not just, what do I want, but what do I will, as a rational member of the human community. And perhaps, in that question, we find both the burden and the beauty of living together as citizens, rather than merely as separate individuals pursuing private goods. The only justification for limiting freedom is harm to others. This radical principle, posed by John Stuart Mill in his 1859 masterwork on liberty, would reshape how liberal societies understand the delicate balance between individual liberty and social responsibility. Mill's answer cut through centuries of philosophical confusion with surgical precision. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. This became known as the harm principle, and it established a new frontier in political philosophy. But Mill understood that freedom without responsibility becomes license, and responsibility without freedom becomes tyranny. His genius lay in recognizing that human flourishing requires both the space to be uniquely ourselves and the wisdom to recognize how our actions ripple outward into the lives of others. In his Victorian world, already roiling with industrial change and social upheaval, Mill saw how individual choices about work, relationships, and expression could either strengthen or weaken the social fabric. He envisioned a society where each person could pursue their own conception of the good life, but always with one eye toward the well-being of the broader community. Observe how this plays out in our digital age, where the boundaries between private choice and public impact have become impossibly complex. When you choose what to post on social media, when you decide whether to wear a mask in public, when you select which news sources to trust, each decision carries both personal and communal consequences. Mill's harm principle doesn't offer simple answers, but it provides a framework for asking the right questions. Does my choice directly harm others? Does it undermine the conditions necessary for others to flourish? Can I distinguish between offensive ideas that should be protected and harmful actions that should be constrained? This brings us to perhaps the most profound application of Mill's thinking, the recognition that true freedom is not the absence of all constraints, but the presence of the right constraints, those that emerge from our collective commitment to each other's well-being. In examining your own life through Mill's lens, you begin to see how your individuality and your social responsibility are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of human flourishing. The question, how does my freedom affect others, becomes not a limitation on your liberty, but a doorway to a more meaningful understanding of what it means to be truly free. And so we find in Mill's 19th century philosophy a timeless guide for 21st century challenges, reminding us that the highest form of freedom is that which enables all of us to flourish together. When Marx studied factory life, he saw exploitation embedded in economic structures. The scene illustrates industrial struggles that inspired his theory of class conflict. His insight asserts that economic systems shape political power. Today's wealth inequality debates mirror these analyses. Viewers can reflect on how economic conditions influence their own opportunities. The industrial landscape of 19th century England tells a story of transformation and exploitation. The clatter of machinery, the endless rows of workers bent over their tasks, the yawning chasm between the factory owners in their grand offices and the laborers in their cramped, dangerous workspaces. What Marx observed was not merely poor working conditions, but something far more profound, a systematic relationship where certain groups extracted value from others through the very structure of economic exchange. The worker, spending hours creating goods worth far more than their wages, was participating in what Marx called surplus value extraction. It was as if the factory system itself had become a kind of living organism that fed on human labor, with the profits flowing upward like sap to the owners. From these observations emerged Marx's revolutionary insight that economic relationships form the foundation upon which all political and social arrangements rest. The social contract, in this view, was not a voluntary agreement among equals, but rather a reflection of underlying class relationships. Those who owned the means of production, the factories, the land, the machinery, held not just economic power, but political power as well. They could influence laws, shape public opinion, and maintain their position through institutions that appeared neutral but served their interests. Marx saw how economic exploitation created political domination, and how political domination in turn protected economic exploitation, a kind of perfect, self-reinforcing cycle. Today, as we witness debates about wealth inequality, universal basic income, and the gig economy, we see Marx's analysis playing out in contemporary form. The question of whether tech workers share the same interests as delivery drivers, whether platform economy billionaires serve the public good, and whether democratic institutions can truly represent diverse economic interests. These all echo Marx's fundamental insight that our economic arrangements shape our political possibilities. As you consider your own place in this system, notice how your economic circumstances influence your political opinions, your life choices, your sense of possibility. The factory floors may have changed, but the relationship between economic structure and human potential remains as relevant today as it was in Marx's time. Society can flourish without centralized authority. Anarchist thinkers challenge the assumption that states are necessary. The belief that voluntary cooperation can replace coercion opens a profound question about human organization itself. Imagine, for a moment, a world where power emerges not from the barrel of a gun or the stroke of a pen, but from the natural inclination of people to collaborate, to share, and to organize themselves according to mutual consent rather than imposed hierarchy. The term anarchism finds its roots in the ancient Greek anarchia, literally meaning without a ruler. Yet this isn't about chaos or disorder, as critics often suggest. The first political philosopher to call himself an anarchist was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in the mid-19th century, but the philosophical seeds were planted much earlier. William Godwin, writing in the Enlightenment era, proposed that human reason alone could guide society without the need for coercive institutions. These thinkers weren't dreamers, they were careful observers of power and authority, recognizing how easily institutions designed to serve people could become masters over them. At the heart of anarchist thought lies a simple yet revolutionary insight. Most human conflicts arise not from the absence of rules, but from the absence of consent. When people truly choose to cooperate, they need no external force to compel them. Consider a neighborhood coming together after a natural disaster. When the lights go out and the phones stop working, what emerges isn't anarchy in the destructive sense, but rather immediate, voluntary organization. People share resources without being told to do so. They coordinate rescue efforts without a central command. They establish fair systems for distributing aid without written laws. This spontaneous cooperation reveals something profound about human nature that statists often overlook. Today, we witness echoes of these anarchist principles in modern decentralized movements. From community-supported agriculture networks that bypass corporate supply chains to decentralized autonomous organizations in the digital realm, from mutual aid societies that emerged during the pandemic to platform cooperatives that put workers in control. These aren't theoretical experiments, but practical applications of voluntary cooperation. They demonstrate that people can organize complex systems through horizontal networks rather than vertical hierarchies. The question isn't whether such arrangements can work. They already do. The question is whether we're brave enough to imagine scaling these principles beyond small communities. As we drift towards sleep, let this question settle gently in your mind. What aspects of your daily life arise naturally from cooperation, and what aspects are maintained only through coercion? Yet not all thinkers shared this optimism about voluntary cooperation. Some looked at revolutionary change and saw not liberation, but dangerous chaos. Stepping back to the close of the 18th century, we encounter a voice of caution amid revolutionary fervor. In the aftermath of revolution, conservative thinkers asked what is lost when societies change too quickly. France, 1790. Edmund Burke sits in his study, pen in hand, watching with growing alarm as the revolutionary fervor swept across Europe. Burke, the Irish-born philosopher who would become the father of modern conservatism, witnessed something that disturbed him deeply: the systematic dismantling of institutions that had taken centuries to build. His question was profound and unsettling. When we tear down what came before us, what wisdom are we discarding? This wasn't merely about politics, it was about understanding how human societies actually function and grow. The conservative insight that emerged from Burke's reflections and those of his intellectual descendants rests on a beautiful and profound understanding of social time. Traditional institutions, they observed, are the product of countless generations of human trial and error, wisdom passed down through countless small decisions and adjustments. Think of it as a vast cathedral, where each stone supports the others. Remove too many stones too quickly, and the entire structure becomes unstable. The conservative recognizes that traditional practices often serve multiple purposes we don't immediately understand. A marriage ceremony isn't just a legal contract. It's a cultural ceremony that transmits values about commitment, community, and social responsibility. Economic systems contain informal networks of trust and obligation that enable prosperity. Religious institutions provide moral frameworks that bind societies together in ways that pure rational calculation cannot achieve. Today, we see these tensions playing out in our contemporary cultural debates. Should we preserve traditional family structures while recognizing evolving definitions of family? How do we honor cultural practices that may not align with modern equality principles? The conservative approach suggests we don't need to burn everything down to build something better. Instead, we might ask, what wisdom exists in these traditions? What purposes do they serve beyond their surface appearance? What can be refined or evolved without losing the deeper insights they've accumulated? The challenge, then, isn't choosing between tradition and progress, but developing the wisdom to distinguish between the essential and the expendable, the timeless wisdom and the merely historical accident. And so we return to Burke's central insight, that the moral imagination of generations cannot be easily replaced by the rational plans of the present moment. Perhaps the deepest conservative wisdom is not about resisting all change, but about approaching transformation with the humility that comes from recognizing how much we owe to those who came before us. When characters in philosophical theories face unequal treatment, they reveal timeless questions about justice. The scene shows dilemmas where fairness clashes with personal loyalty. Imagine a small community where a beloved neighbor has broken a rule that others would face harsh punishment for. The mayor must decide, show favoritism to someone we care about, or apply the law impartially to all. The tension between what feels right in our hearts and what principle demands from our minds creates one of philosophy's most persistent puzzles. The deeper question emerges: can justice ever truly be blind, or must it sometimes make room for the messy realities of human relationships? John Rawls, one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, approached this dilemma through what he called the original position, a thought experiment as elegant as it is profound. Picture yourself designing the rules of society, but with a crucial twist. You don't know what position you'll occupy in that society. Will you be rich or poor, talented or struggling, from a privileged background or facing systemic barriers? This veil of ignorance, as Rawls called it, would strip away all knowledge of your particular circumstances, leaving you with only the most general facts about human nature and society. In this moment of radical uncertainty, what principles of justice would you choose? Rawls argued that rational people behind this veil would inevitably select two fundamental principles. First, equal basic liberties for all, and second, social and economic inequalities would only be acceptable if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. The brilliance of Rawls insight lies in how it transforms our understanding of fairness. It's not about treating everyone exactly the same, what philosophers call formal equality. Instead, it's about creating conditions where everyone has genuine, effective opportunities to flourish. Think of it like designing a race. Should we make everyone start at the same line, or should we consider giving some runners a head start if they face systemic disadvantages? Rawls' difference principle suggests that inequalities are only just when they lift up those who are struggling most, creating what he called fair equality of opportunity. This principle recognizes that a society's true measure isn't how well its most advantaged members do, but how it treats those who start from the most challenging positions. The goal isn't equality of outcome, but equality of genuine opportunity to develop one's potential and contribute meaningfully to the common good. Today, we see these debates playing out in discussions about equity versus equality, affirmative action policies, and economic redistribution. The tensions Rawls identified remain as relevant as ever. How do we balance individual merit with systemic barriers? When does preferential treatment become reverse discrimination? The philosopher's answer lies not in finding perfect solutions, but in committing to the ongoing work of creating institutions and practices that honor both our individual dignity and our shared responsibility for each other's flourishing. In your own life, this might mean examining when your loyalties conflict with fairness, perhaps in workplace decisions, community disputes, or family matters. The invitation is not to become coldly impartial, but to hold both compassion and principle in balance, recognizing that true justice often requires us to love others enough to apply standards fairly, even when it costs us personally. Let this thought settle as gently as evening light. Justice may be the most difficult thing we ever practice, but it remains the foundation upon which all lasting peace is built. But even the most carefully designed systems of justice face a persistent threat, one that emerges from human nature itself. When a hypothetical ruler gains unchecked power, the scenario exposes how corruption grows in silence. This is not merely a theoretical exercise, but a profound mirror reflecting how power operates in our world. We might imagine this ruler starting with good intentions, perhaps genuinely believing in their cause. Yet as constraints dissolve and accountability fades, something subtle begins to shift. The mind that once questioned itself now trusts its own judgment implicitly. The voice that once welcomed dissent now grows impatient with contradiction. What once seemed like necessary compromises now appear as justified measures. In this quiet transformation, corruption doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers, it rationalizes, it normalizes. The wisdom of Lord Acton captures this phenomenon with crystalline precision. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Writing in 1887 to an Anglican bishop, this English historian understood that the corruption isn't merely about personal moral failing, but about the structural impossibility of unchecked authority. When power has no meaningful limits, it doesn't just risk corruption, it becomes corruption. The very nature of absolute authority creates the conditions where the ruler's will becomes the only standard, where expedience replaces principle, and where the governed exist to serve the ruler rather than vice versa. The ancient philosophers recognized that power must be distributed, constrained, and constantly questioned, not out of cynicism about human nature, but out of wisdom about its vulnerabilities. Institutions become more than bureaucratic machinery. They become the guardians of human freedom itself. Think of checks and balances as the immune system of a society, constantly working to identify and contain the infections of unchecked authority. Courts, that can challenge executive actions, legislatures that can investigate and subpoena, free press that can question and expose, independent civil service that can maintain continuity beyond political changes. These aren't obstacles to effective governance. They are the very conditions that make legitimate governance possible. When we weaken these institutions in the name of efficiency or unity, we aren't simplifying government. We're making it more vulnerable to the very corruption we claim to fear. The pattern manifests everywhere we look. Corporate executives who begin with fiduciary responsibility to shareholders but end with a sense of entitlement to extraordinary compensation. Community leaders who start as servants but gradually adopt the posture of indispensable authorities. Social media platforms that begin with connection and conversation but evolve into mechanisms of control and manipulation. Each case follows the same quiet progression. Good intentions met with few constraints, followed by rationalization, then normalization, and finally the complete transformation of means into ends. The corrupt official doesn't wake up one morning and decide to be corrupt. They simply discover that corruption has become their only available path forward. This insight demands our personal attention as well. In our families, our workplaces, our communities, we all exercise forms of power, and we all face the same subtle temptations toward corruption. The parent who confuses control with care, the manager who mistakes authority for wisdom, the activist who prioritizes purity over effectiveness. Recognizing this possibility isn't pessimism, it's wisdom. It means we must create our own systems of accountability, welcome questioning as a gift rather than a threat, and remember that power, at its best, is always temporary, always accountable, and always in service to something greater than ourselves. The corruption of power isn't inevitable. It's a choice we make, one quiet decision at a time. Belonging is not just legal, but deeply emotional. Picture a person standing at the threshold of a new land, holding official papers that grant entry, yet feeling uncertain about whether they truly belong. This scene, repeated throughout human history, reveals something essential about citizenship that goes far beyond legal definitions. The philosophers who have wrestled with this paradox understand that belonging operates on multiple layers simultaneously. There's the formal recognition by the state, the passport, the voting rights, the legal protections that define us as citizens in the eyes of the law. But beneath this surface of legal recognition lies something far more complex and delicate. The emotional landscape of feeling at home, of recognizing yourself within the shared story of a community, of finding your place in the ongoing narrative of a people. This dual nature of citizenship, legal status and emotional belonging, creates what we might call the belonging paradox. A person can be granted every legal right and protection, yet still feel like an outsider, looking in at a community that seems to operate according to unspoken rules and shared assumptions. Conversely, one can feel deeply connected to a place and its people while lacking formal recognition as a citizen. The great political thinkers have long recognized this tension. From Aristotle's observation that the citizen is one who shares in the administration of justice and government, to T.H. Marshall's seminal work on citizenship rights, theorists have grappled with the question of whether true citizenship requires active participation or can exist as a more passive legal status. But perhaps the most profound insight comes from understanding that neither the legal nor the emotional dimension alone is sufficient. True citizenship emerges from their dynamic interaction, like two streams converging to form a river. In our contemporary world, this philosophical insight becomes profoundly practical through the lens of migration and social integration. Every day, millions of people navigate the complex terrain between legal recognition and emotional belonging. They learn new languages, adapt to different customs, and gradually build new relationships, all while their sense of identity evolves and expands. The question that political philosophy asks is not merely how we should process these individual journeys, but how societies can create conditions that honor both the necessity of legal boundaries and the human need for belonging. Consider the moment when someone first participates in a community gathering, perhaps sharing a meal with neighbors who were once strangers, or when they cast their first ballot in an election that will shape their new home. These moments represent more than individual milestones. They are instances where the legal and emotional dimensions of citizenship begin to weave together into something richer and more complete than either could achieve alone. As we reflect on these questions of citizenship and belonging, we might consider how we, ourselves, participate in welcoming others into our shared spaces. Whether these are physical communities, professional networks, or digital spaces where ideas are exchanged. The manner in which we extend belonging to others often reveals as much about our own understanding of citizenship as it does about the newcomers seeking their place within our collective life. The social contract, in its deepest sense, asks not merely how we structure our institutions and laws, but how we create the conditions for genuine human flourishing within our shared political communities. And perhaps the greatest insight political philosophy offers is this: belonging is both the foundation and the ultimate goal of any just society, a place where legal recognition and emotional connection converge to create the possibility of truly shared life. Let this thought settle gently in your mind as we continue our exploration of how political philosophy illuminates the nature of justice itself. When two people claim conflicting rights, the dilemma reveals political philosophy's difficulty in balancing freedoms. Imagine, if you will, a crowded public square where one person's exercise of free speech clashes with another's right to peaceful assembly. The scenario shows how rights must coexist without domination. This insight highlights the need for negotiation. In the elegant framework of John Rawls' theory of justice, such conflicts represent what he called the challenge of achieving justice as fairness in a pluralistic society where citizens hold diverse and often competing moral views. Rawls, in his profound work Political Liberalism, recognized that in any complex society, people will naturally develop different and sometimes conflicting comprehensive doctrines about how life should be lived. Today's social debates often hinge on rights collisions in ways that would be familiar to political philosophers throughout history. Consider the contemporary tension between religious liberty claims and LGBTQ+ rights, or between freedom of speech and hate speech regulations. Each represents what Rawls termed the problem of maintaining social unity while respecting deep diversity. The philosopher's genius lay not in offering simple solutions, but in creating frameworks for rational dialogue. His concept of overlapping consensus suggests that even with different underlying beliefs, people can find common ground in shared political values. In this digital age, social media platforms grapple daily with conflicts between users, rights to expression and others, rights to safety and dignity. Viewers can apply this philosophical wisdom by practicing empathy during disagreements, recognizing that most rights conflicts arise from competing legitimate values rather than simple malice. When we encounter someone whose views seem opposed to our own, we might pause to consider Rawls' insight that we are all trying to live according to reasonable but different conceptions of the good life. This doesn't mean abandoning our principles, but rather approaching conflicts with what Rawls called public reason, the willingness to justify our positions using arguments that others, even if they disagree with our conclusions, might reasonably accept. The practical art of negotiation in rights conflicts becomes not about winning, but about creating space where multiple ways of life can flourish without overwhelming one another. And so we return to our fundamental understanding. The social contract is not a rigid framework, but a living dialogue about how we can live together despite our differences. Rawls reminds us that in the original position, that thought experiment where we choose society's principles without knowing our place in it, we would all want a system capable of managing rights conflicts fairly. The social contract paradox dissolves not when we find perfect harmony, but when we develop the collective wisdom to navigate our inevitable disagreements with mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. In this gentle recognition of our common humanity, we find the strength to build societies where rights can coexist, not through uniformity, but through the mature art of democratic dialogue and compromise. Picture yourself as a leader faced with a profound moral crossroads. Your nation stands on the brink of crisis, and you possess knowledge that could either stabilize the situation or plunge it into chaos. You could speak the complete truth, a transparent disclosure that might spark panic and uncertainty among your people. Or you could choose strategic silence, a carefully measured response that maintains order but requires you to withhold critical information. In this thought experiment, the weight of decisions settles not on what will work best politically, but on what aligns with your deepest understanding of ethical responsibility. The tension between honesty and strategic silence reveals something essential about the human condition. We are creatures who must navigate between our desire for truth and our obligation to protect others from harm. This moment of choice illuminates how moral dilemmas fundamentally shape the quality of leadership itself. Consider the ancient wisdom of virtue ethics, which teaches us that character is revealed not in easy choices, but in moments of profound ethical pressure. When a leader must decide whether truth serves justice better than silence serves compassion, they are engaging with the most ancient questions of political philosophy. The ethical framework we choose in leadership, whether deontological duty to absolute truth, consequentialist calculation of outcomes, or virtue-based character development, becomes the architecture of our decision-making. This is why the social contract demands more than competence. It demands moral courage, the willingness to be bound by ethical principles even when those principles make leadership more difficult. The integrity of authority, as the great political philosophers have observed, lies not in the power to command, but in the consistency between one's values and one's actions. The insight that integrity must guide authority finds its most complex expression in the tension between what Machiavelli called the necessity of statecraft and what virtue ethics demands of human character. We see this played out repeatedly in modern leadership failures, leaders who chose expediency over honesty, who sacrificed transparency for perceived stability, who believed that the ends could justify any means. But history reveals the profound error in this calculation. When authority is divorced from integrity, when the social contract becomes merely a tool for compliance rather than a covenant of mutual trust, the entire foundation of legitimate governance crumbles. True leadership authority emerges not from the ability to control, but from the capacity to be trustworthy, to act consistently with declared values, and to face difficult truths rather than manipulate them. This is why the most enduring leaders in history, those whose influence transcended their immediate circumstances, were precisely those who understood that moral authority precedes and sustains political authority. In our contemporary world, this ancient wisdom speaks directly to how we exercise leadership in our daily lives, whether in our families, our workplaces, or our communities. The question of transparency versus strategic communication arises in countless situations. When your teenager asks about family finances, when your team questions organizational decisions, when your neighbors seek honesty about community issues, the ethical framework you apply in these moments shapes not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term quality of your relationships and influence. Leading with transparency doesn't mean sharing every detail indiscriminately. It means committing to truth as your fundamental value, speaking with courage when difficult conversations are necessary, and building trust through consistency between your words and actions. This is the essence of ethical leadership, the recognition that our capacity to guide others flows directly from our commitment to moral integrity, making us not just effective leaders, but trustworthy ones. As we rest in this understanding, we recognize that the greatest power any leader can possess is the power that comes from being genuinely worthy of trust. Political philosophers saw the dangers of misinformation centuries before the internet transformed communication. In Plato's Republic, written over 2,000 years ago, we find the concept of the noble lie, the troubling recognition that those in power might deliberately shape narratives to maintain social order. Plato understood that truth and authority exist in perpetual tension, that the very nature of political power involves controlling not just physical territory, but the realm of ideas themselves. His allegory of the cave revealed how those who claim to see truth might actually be casting shadows that serve their own interests. This ancient insight proves remarkably prescient when we consider our current digital landscape, where the very architecture of information sharing has been revolutionized, yet the fundamental human struggle between truth and power remains unchanged. The philosophers who came after Plato, from Machiavelli's counsel on maintaining authority through carefully managed perception, to Hobbes' recognition that sovereign power depends on controlling the stories people tell themselves about legitimacy, all understood that political stability requires managing not just facts, but the very frameworks through which facts are interpreted and believed. Today, our digital landscapes have created unprecedented amplification of these ancient power struggles. What philosophers once observed in the corridors of royal courts or the pages of state-controlled newspapers now unfolds in real time across global networks. The speed at which information and misinformation can spread has created a new dimension in the eternal contest between truth and authority. Consider how quickly narratives can be shaped, challenged, and reshaped across social media platforms. This mirrors exactly what political theorists predicted, that technological changes in communication would fundamentally alter how power operates, not by eliminating the human desire to control information, but by making that control both more vital and more difficult to maintain. The ancient concern that those who control the narrative control the polity has evolved into a world where every individual citizen has become both a potential broadcaster and a potential validator of truth claims. This democratization of information, while offering extraordinary opportunities for genuine knowledge sharing, has also created what philosophers would recognize as a new form of the state of nature, a digital realm where competing versions of reality clash without clear arbiter. Our current online conflicts reflect these predictions with startling accuracy. The very mechanisms that social media platforms use to keep users engaged, algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy, echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs, and the emotional triggers that drive sharing, all amplify the kind of motivated reasoning that political philosophers understood centuries ago. When we observe the way online discourse fragments into opposing tribes, each with their own accepted truths and trusted sources, we're seeing the digital manifestation of the factionalism that Madison warned would destroy Republican government. The speed at which conspiracy theories can proliferate demonstrates exactly what Hobbes feared about the dangers of unregulated information flows in the absence of a governing authority. Yet the solution isn't as simple as returning to centralized control. because the digital age has also enabled forms of collective intelligence and democratic participation that earlier philosophers could barely imagine. We find ourselves in precisely the paradox that Rousseau anticipated. The same technology that promises to liberate human communication also threatens to fragment the shared reality necessary for genuine social contract to function. The practical application of this philosophical wisdom begins with mindful engagement with digital information. Rather than becoming paralyzed by the complexity of our information environment, we can apply the critical thinking tools that political philosophers developed for navigating power and truth. This means approaching online content with the same skepticism that we would bring to a political speech or news report, understanding that the digital medium doesn't automatically confer legitimacy or accuracy. We must recognize that our natural cognitive biases, the tendency to seek information that confirms our existing beliefs, the preference for simple explanations over complex realities, are being amplified by design in digital spaces. The philosopher's insights remind us that truth requires effort, dialogue, and sometimes uncomfortable self-examination. In our daily digital interactions, we can practice the virtue of intellectual humility that Socrates exemplified, remaining open to being wrong while maintaining the courage to question authority and established narratives. By bringing this philosophical awareness to our online lives, we participate in the ongoing project of democratic self-governance, ensuring that our digital spaces serve genuine human flourishing rather than becoming mere tools for manipulation and control. The social contract lives not just in our formal institutions, but in every moment we choose thoughtful engagement over reactive consumption, every time we prioritize understanding over being right, and every instance where we contribute to building rather than fragmenting our shared reality. Do our duties now extend beyond national borders? Political philosophy grapples with this shifting reality. The narrative shows how global issues blur boundaries of justice. Modern crises like climate change embody these tensions. Viewers can consider their role in global citizenship. We now face one of the most profound challenges that globalization presents to political philosophy. For centuries, thinkers from Hobbes to Rawls constructed theories of justice within the comfortable boundaries of the nation-state. Their social contracts assumed clear territorial limits, shared cultural understanding, and the authority of sovereign governments to enforce agreements among their citizens. But now, as philosopher Thomas Pogge reminds us, the very foundations of these theories crumble when faced with a world where economic decisions made in one continent directly impact lives on another, where environmental decisions in one generation constrain the possibilities of all future generations, and where technological advances allow for real-time solidarity across every border that ever existed. Consider climate change as our modern embodiment of this philosophical crisis. When a factory in Bangladesh contributes to greenhouse gas emissions that flood coastal communities in Bangladesh, when policy decisions in Washington affect monsoon patterns in Mumbai, when industrial practices in the Amazon influence rainfall patterns across the Sahel, what traditional social contract can account for these interconnected obligations? The classical theorists who debated what citizens owed one another within their own borders never imagined a world where the very air we breathe and the climate we share would create moral obligations that transcend every line ever drawn on a map. Yet here we stand in the philosophical aftermath of globalization, where our duties seem to extend not just beyond our neighborhoods or cities, but beyond our nations themselves. This brings us to the fascinating question of global citizenship, not as a legal status or passport, but as a moral identity that acknowledges our shared vulnerability and interdependence. The ancient Stoics spoke of cosmopolitanism, of being citizens of the world, but they lived in an age when such ideals could remain somewhat abstract. Today, We inhabit a world where global supply chains mean that the smartphone in your pocket contains minerals mined by hands that will never know the comfort of the stability that the social contracts of your own nation provide. Where the economic decisions of your government may determine whether a child on another continent will have access to clean water, where the environmental policies of your generation may determine whether any child, anywhere, will inherit a habitable planet. And so, as our interconnected world grows ever smaller, political philosophy finds itself writing new chapters in the ancient story of justice, not bound by borders, but shaped by the simple recognition that in our shared humanity, we find both our greatest vulnerability and our deepest responsibility. When individuals choose cooperation over competition, they reveal political philosophy's deepest hope. In our quiet contemplation this evening, we have journeyed through the great debates about power, justice, and the very foundations of social order. Now, in this moment of gentle reflection, we discover something profound. The deepest insight of all political thought points toward our capacity for collaborative flourishing. When people set aside their individual ambitions in favor of shared purpose, when communities prioritize collective well-being over personal gain, they embody the most sophisticated understanding of what political philosophy has always sought: the art of living together with dignity and purpose. The social contract theories we have explored, from Hobbes' Leviathan to Rousseau's general will, from Locke's natural rights to Rawls' veil of ignorance, all converge on this central insight. Peaceful coexistence requires our voluntary participation in something larger than ourselves. The ancient Greek concept of sympathy, the capacity to feel with others, finds its political expression in modern democratic participation. When citizens engage mindfully in their communities, when they practice what we might call deliberate cooperation, they create the stability that philosophers have long sought through abstract theories. This is not the coerced harmony of authoritarian rule, but the natural order that emerges when humans recognize their fundamental interdependence. Contemporary communities worldwide demonstrate this principle in countless ways. Local food cooperatives, where neighbors share resources and knowledge. Community land trusts that preserve affordable housing through collective ownership. Participatory budgeting processes, where citizens directly decide how public funds are spent. Mutual aid networks that have flourished even during global challenges, showing how quickly humans can organize for collective care when traditional institutions fall short. These are not utopian experiments, but practical applications of political philosophy's deepest wisdom, that we flourish most fully when we contribute to the flourishing of others. The peace that grows from such mindful participation extends beyond individual communities. It creates the foundation for more just and sustainable societies at every level. In your daily life, this ancient wisdom offers immediate, concrete possibilities. Practice what we might call micro-deliberation, taking a moment before making decisions to consider their impact on your community. Support local businesses that embody cooperative values. Participate in neighborhood initiatives, even small ones, like community gardens or tool libraries. Practice deep listening in political discussions, seeking understanding rather than victory. Each of these acts of collective care contributes to the larger harmony that political philosophy has always envisioned. As we prepare to conclude our journey together, carry forward this understanding. The most profound political insights are not found in distant theories, but in the daily choice to build bridges instead of walls, to nurture community instead of competition. In this gentle practice lies the seeds of truly harmonious societies, growing quietly but persistently, one mindful act of cooperation at a time. What if true political strength begins with calm contemplation? As we reach the end of our philosophical journey together, This question invites us to consider a profound transformation, not in the world around us, but within ourselves. The insight that awaits us is remarkably simple yet transformative. Awareness transforms helplessness into agency. Through understanding political ideas, we discover that the anxiety and stress we feel about politics can soften, replaced by something far more powerful, a sense of calm understanding and measured engagement. Tonight, we explore how this tranquility can become the foundation for more meaningful civic participation. Consider how political knowledge functions as an antidote to civic anxiety. When we understand the historical evolution of political thought, when we recognize the timeless patterns of power and justice that philosophers from different eras have wrestled with, something remarkable happens to our relationship with current events. The breaking news that once sent our hearts racing becomes part of a larger conversation, one that has been unfolding for centuries. Modern political stress, that overwhelming sense that everything depends on the next election or the latest crisis, begins to dissolve when we see these moments as chapters in humanity's ongoing exploration of how we should live together. This understanding creates what we might call philosophical resilience, the ability to engage with political life without being overwhelmed by it. When we recognize that democratic participation is not about achieving perfect outcomes, but about contributing thoughtfully to an ongoing conversation about justice and the common good, our role becomes both more humble and more significant. We become citizens who can listen deeply, speak thoughtfully, and act deliberately. The panic that once accompanied political discourse transforms into measured consideration, and the despair that often follows electoral outcomes gives way to sustained commitment to civic values that transcend any particular moment. As our philosophical journey draws to a close, we return to where we began, with the recognition that political philosophy is not merely an academic exercise, but a path to personal peace and effective citizenship. The social contract paradox that has guided our exploration reveals its deepest truth. When we understand the foundations of political authority, we gain the freedom to engage with civic life from a place of wisdom rather than anxiety. You now carry with you the insights of centuries of political thought, not as rigid doctrine, but as contemplative tools for understanding your world. As you return to your daily life, may you carry this tranquility into your civic engagement, speaking with the calm authority that comes from deep understanding, listening with the patience that recognizes the complexity of human governance, and acting with the confidence that your thoughtful participation contributes to humanity's ongoing project of creating more just and peaceful communities.